Imagine a world where people are literally starving in the streets, factories are sitting completely idle, and society is just sort of collapsing into widespread poverty.
Right.
And it's not because there's a famine, right? And not because of some terrible natural disaster, but because there is simply too much food, too many clothes, and too many manufactured goods. You have an economy that is basically suffocating on its own absolute abundance.
It sounds like a paradox, honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
we are so conditioned to think of economic crises as a lack of things,
Yeah.
like a shortage of resources or a failure of crops. But the framework we're looking at today completely flips that on its head. It argues that under our current economic system, the most devastating crises are actually crises of overproduction.
Yeah, and that counterintuitive idea is really the beating heart of the deep dive you, our listener, have sent us into today. You've provided us with this incredibly dense, fascinating stack of source texts. We're looking at extensive excerpts from the Marx and Engels collected works, which are, often referred to as the MECW.
Right.
And you've specifically tasked us with unpacking their theories on revolution, the structural mechanics of capitalism, and a term that carries just an enormous amount of historical baggage, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat.
It's a heavy stack. I mean, we're looking at decades of their writing here. It traces an arc from their early sort of philosophical critiques all the way to the really rigorous mathematical models of capital, and then, of course, to their later urgent analyses of real-world events like the 1848 revolutions across Europe and the Paris Commune.
Yeah, but before we take a single step further, I feel like we really need to establish a clear baseline for this deep dive. Because these sources deal with concepts that have undeniably shaped global history, right? And they've sparked intense political polarization.
Oh, absolutely.
So we are approaching this strictly as an analytical exercise. We are not taking sides here. We are not here to endorse the Marxist framework, and we're not here to critique or condemn it either. Our mission today is just to act as impartial translators of the original source material you provided. We're going to explore the internal logic of Marx and Engels' arguments, basically tracing how they get from point A to point Z, exactly as they laid it out on the page.
And that neutrality is just essential if we want to actually understand the text. I mean, we have to temporarily suspend a century and a half of geopolitical baggage.
Right, totally.
We have to look at the actual mechanics they were trying to describe. They were attempting to build a structural diagnostic model of how society operates. It's much like early physicists trying to map the laws of thermodynamics. It's a system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when you actually read these original texts, the narrative is vastly different from, the pop culture summary of Marxism. I think the common assumption is that their critique of capitalism is primarily a moral one,
Yeah, the capitalists are just greedy.
Exactly. That it's a system of bad people doing bad things to good workers, and if we could just get nicer bosses, the system would work out fine. But the texts in Volume 24 paint a picture that is entirely devoid of morality. They describe capitalist exploitation as this cold, mathematical reality that literally cannot be reformed.
The absence of moralizing is perhaps the most crucial starting point. Marx actually bends over backwards in Capital to assume that the capitalist market functions perfectly according to its own rules.
Yeah, he gives them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly. He says, let's assume every commodity is bought and sold at its true fair market value. Let's assume there's no cheating, no monopolies artificially jacking up prices, no theft in the legal sense. Even under those perfect idealized conditions, he argues that the math of the system intrinsically requires exploitation.
Right, and to understand that math, we really have to look at how they define the transaction between a worker and an employer. The text makes this razor-sharp distinction between labor and labor power. The capitalist isn't buying the worker's labor exactly. They're buying the worker's capacity to work for a specific duration, like a day or a week.
And that distinction between labor and labor power is the linchpin of the entire theory of surplus value. I mean, in this theoretical model, everything in the market is a commodity, right? And every commodity has a value determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. So if you are a worker, your labor power is your commodity. You take it to the market and you sell it to a factory owner.
And the value of my labor power, just like, say, a loaf of bread or a lump of coal, is determined by the cost of producing it.
Right.
For a human being, the cost of production is just whatever it takes to keep me alive and functioning. It's the food I eat, the rent I pay for shelter, the clothes on my back, and maybe the basic training required to, operate the machines safely.
We can actually put hypothetical numbers to this just to see the mechanism at work. Let's say that producing all those necessities, your food, your shelter, your clothing, requires, on average, 6 hours of labor across society. Therefore, the daily value of your labor power is equivalent to 6 hours of work.
Okay, so I go to the factory, and the capitalist pays me a wage that equals the value of those 6 hours. I get paid enough to survive and come back the next day. In classical economic terms, that's a perfectly fair exchange, right? I sold my commodity, I got its full value in wages. Nobody cheated me.
The exchange on the market was entirely fair. But the consumption of that commodity happens outside the market, on the factory floor. And this is where Marx locates the mathematical engine of capitalism. The capitalist bought your capacity to work for an entire day, but you only need to work for 6 hours to generate the value equivalent to your wage.
Right.
If the capitalist sent you home after 6 hours, they would merely break even.
But I don't go home after 6 hours. The standard working day during their era was often 10, 12, or even 14 hours.
Yeah, brutal hours.
So for those first 6 hours, I am working for myself. I'm reproducing the value of my wage. But for the next 6 or 8 hours, I am still working, I'm still producing value, but I am not being compensated for it.
Marx terms that second portion of the day unpaid labor. The value you create during those remaining hours is surplus value. It is value generated beyond the cost of your labor power, and it flows directly into the pocket of the capitalist. According to the mechanics laid out in the texts, this surplus value is the sole source of capitalist profit. Without that gap between the value of labor power and the value labor actually creates in a day, profit literally ceases to exist.
I was thinking about this, and it's kind of like buying a rechargeable battery. When you go to the store, you pay for the physical object, right? The plastic casing, the lithium inside, the cost of manufacturing it. You pay the fair market price for the battery itself. That's the wage.
Right, okay.
But once you take it home and plug it into your device, you get all the electricity, all the energy it discharges over its lifespan entirely for free.
Yeah.
If you had to pay the battery for every single spark of electricity it generated while in use, you'd never buy it in the first place. You only buy it because you get more energy out of it than you paid for to acquire it.
That analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The capitalist purchases the physical vessel, the worker's time and physical capacity. But the energy expended, the actual value created during the working day, belongs entirely to the purchaser. And this leads to a profound structural conclusion. If a well-meaning philanthropic factory owner decided to just pay their workers for the full 12 hours of value they produced, rather than just the 6 hours required for their subsistence, that owner would generate zero profit.
They would immediately go bankrupt, or at the very least, they would cease to be a capitalist. They'd just be like a coordinator breaking even.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why Marx and Engels argued that the system cannot be reformed. I mean, you can pass laws to make the factory safer or limit the working day to 8 hours instead of 14, but you cannot pass a law abolishing the extraction of surplus value while keeping capitalism intact.
Because it's the whole point.
Right. The extraction of surplus value isn't a bug in the system. It is the operating system itself. If you eliminate it, capital accumulation stops dead.
Which means the exploitation is locked in at a mathematical level. It's structural. And that structure creates a downstream effect that brings us back to the paradox we started with, the crises of overproduction, which they detail extensively in Volume 25. If the workers are never paid the full value of the goods they produce, the math dictates a terrifying reality for the broader economy.
The contradiction is built right into the wage system. The working class makes up the vast majority of the consuming public. But because a significant portion of the value they create is constantly siphoned off as surplus value, their purchasing power is perpetually restricted. They can never collectively afford to buy back the total output of society.
Let's follow the numbers on that just to be clear. If a society produces $100 million worth of goods, but the workers were only paid $50 million in wages, there is a massive deficit in purchasing power.
Yeah, and the capitalist class, the minority holding the surplus value, cannot physically consume the remaining $50 million worth of manufactured goods. I mean, they can only eat so many meals, buy so many houses, wear so many clothes.
Right, a billionaire only wears one pair of shoes at a time.
Exactly. So what do they do with the surplus? They reinvest it, they use it as capital to build larger factories, buy more efficient machinery, and hire more workers to generate even more surplus value.
This creates an exponential growth curve in production. The factories are pumping out an ever-increasing mountain of goods, shoes, coats, tools, food. But the wages of the masses, their ability to consume, doesn't grow at that same exponential rate. It's artificially capped by the mechanics of labor power we just discussed.
The inevitable result is a market glut. Production wildly outstrips consumption. The warehouses fill up with goods that nobody has the money to buy. The capitalists realize they can't sell their products, so prices crash. To cut their losses, they shut down the factories, stop ordering raw materials, and throw the workers out on the street.
And suddenly, you have widespread starvation and misery, triggered directly by the fact that society has produced too much wealth. The baker is starving because he baked too much bread, and the price collapsed, so the bakery closed.
It is a devastating cycle that Marx and Engels saw playing out repeatedly in the 19th century. In earlier historical epochs, as Engels points out, economic crises were always crises of scarcity. A drought, a plague, a war or something destroyed the capacity to produce, and people suffered because there wasn't enough to go around.
Right.
Capitalism is historically unique because its crises are born from abundance.
The system essentially chokes on its own productivity. And this brings them to a terminal diagnosis for capitalism. They argue that the capitalist mode of production has become a fetter on the further development of society. It's unleashed these godlike productive forces, machinery, global trade, industrial agriculture, but the narrow rules of private property and wage labor cannot manage the very forces they've summoned. It's like a sorcerer who's lost control of his own magic.
Because of this inherent mathematical flaw, relying on the philanthropy of the bourgeoisie or trying to pass gradual reforms is viewed by the authors as a dead end. When a crisis of overproduction hits, the smaller capitalists go bankrupt, and their assets are swallowed up by the larger ones.
Yeah, Amazon buys up all the mom-and-pop shops.
Right. The capital just becomes more concentrated, the monopolies grow larger, and the system resets for an even more devastating crash down the line. It's a structural engine that cannot be turned off from the inside.
So if you're a worker reading this in the 1800s and you realize the economic game is structurally rigged, your next logical thought is going to be political. You might say, fine, the economy is programmed to exploit us, but we have a government, we have a state, there are more of us than there are of them. Why don't we just organize, vote, and use the state machinery to change the laws and outlaw capitalism?
It is the most natural, intuitive question. If you are suffering under a set of economic rules, you look to the political authority to change those rules. Marx and Engels dedicated a massive portion of their theoretical work to answering precisely that question. And their answer requires us to fundamentally rethink what the state actually is.
Yeah, we tend to view the state as a neutral referee, a neutral set of institutions, the courts, the police, the parliament that sort of sit above society, mediating disputes, blowing the whistle when someone breaks the rules, and generally trying to keep things fair for everyone. But the sources, particularly volume 26, where Engels writes about the origins of the family, private property, and the state, completely dismantled that idea.
They argue that the state is not some eternal neutral arbiter that has always existed. In fact, for the vast majority of human history, during periods of primitive communism or early tribal societies, there was no state. There were no standing armies, no specialized police forces, no prisons, and no bureaucratic class separated from the rest of the population.
Wait, so what changed? Why did humanity suddenly need a state apparatus?
The catalyst was the development of agriculture, surplus wealth, and the resulting split of society into antagonistic classes. Once you have a society divided between a class that owns the primary wealth, whether that's land, slaves, or later factories, and a class that produces that wealth, you have an irreconcilable conflict of interest.
If that conflict was left to play out naturally, the exploited majority would constantly rebel against the exploiting minority. Society would just burn itself down in an endless civil war.
To prevent that societal collapse, a power was needed to keep the class antagonisms in check. But this power did not arise to create a fair compromise. The state was created by the economically dominant class to maintain the conditions of their dominance. It arose to forcibly keep the exploited classes in the condition of oppression required by that specific mode of production.
One of the excerpts from volume 22 describes the modern bourgeois state in incredibly vivid terms. It talks about the standing army, the police, the vast bureaucracy, the clergy, the judicature, and refers to this entire massive apparatus as a boa constrictor in toiling civil society. I mean, it's not a referee, it's a weapon.
Marx goes so far as to call the modern state machinery a joint stock company for managing the common affairs of the capitalist class. Its primary function, backed by a legal monopoly on violence, is to protect private property and ensure the smooth continuation of the wage labor system. It doesn't matter if it takes the form of a constitutional monarchy or a democratic republic with a parliament. The core architecture of the state is built to serve capital.
It's like trying to use a corporation's HR department to organize a labor strike against the CEO. I mean, the HR department might have a friendly face, they might mediate minor disputes between employees, but fundamentally, that department wasn't built to protect the workers from the company. It was designed, funded, and structured to protect the company from the workers. You can't use the very tool of your subjugation to emancipate yourself.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The bureaucratic, hierarchical nature of the state, the separation of the military from the general population, the intricate legal codes, all of these were forged over centuries to secure the power of the ruling class. And this realization wasn't just theoretical for Marx and Engels. It was forged in the fires of actual historical events, most notably the revolutions of 1848 and 1849.
Yeah, the 1848 revolutions were a massive turning point because before that, in the Communist Manifesto, they spoke somewhat abstractly about the proletariat winning the battle of democracy. There was a sense that maybe the workers could just gain political traction within the existing systems.
But 1848 shattered that illusion. Across Europe, in France, in the German states, in Italy, the working classes rose up, demanding political rights and economic relief. And in every instance, the existing state machinery, even the newly formed liberal republics, turned their cannons and standing armies against the workers.
Wow.
The state revealed its true nature as an engine of class despotism.
And watching that slaughter led Marx to a crucial pivot in his political theory. He concluded that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Like we said, you cannot take the HR department and use it to fire the CEO. The bourgeois state is fundamentally incompatible with proletarian emancipation.
The inescapable conclusion they drew from 1848, and later reinforced by the Paris Commune, was that the existing state machine must be broken. It must be smashed. You cannot reform the police force, the standing army, or the uncountable bureaucracy. You have to dismantle them completely because their very DNA is hierarchical and anti-democratic.
But that raises a terrifying logistical problem, honestly. If you smash the state, if you abolish the police, disband the army, tear up the courts and the bureaucracy, what happens at 8 a.m. the next morning? Society doesn't just automatically synchronize into a peaceful utopia. If you remove the only apparatus holding society together, don't you just plunge into violent chaos? What replaces the smashed state?
And that question leads us into what is undeniably the most provocative, the most debated, and historically the most misunderstood concept in the entire Marxist lexicon, the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you and I, sitting here in the 21st century, hear the word dictatorship, we immediately picture the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. We think of a single autocrat in a military uniform, ruling by decree, with secret police and absolute suppression of speech. The word is just synonymous with tyranny.
To understand what Marx and Engels meant, we'd have to strip away that 20th century baggage and contextualize the word as it was used in the mid-19th century. The term dictator originated in the Roman Republic. It referred to an extraordinary magistrate who was granted emergency powers for a strictly limited temporary period to deal with a specific crisis, usually a war or a rebellion. It wasn't meant to be a permanent system of government.
And in 19th century political theory, the concept was often used to describe the extraordinary rule of a specific group or class during a period of revolutionary upheaval. The sources show Marx first utilizing the specific phrase dictatorship of the proletariat in his analysis of the French struggles in 1850, found in Volume 10. He's not talking about one man with a mustache taking over. He's talking about the class rule of the entire proletariat.
Exactly. The foundational logic here is that Marx viewed every state as a dictatorship of one class over another. From his perspective, a bourgeois republic, even one with a constitution and elections, is fundamentally a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, because the capitalist class holds the structural economic power and uses the state apparatus to enforce their property rights.
So, if the capitalists currently have a dictatorship via the bourgeois state, the workers, upon overthrowing capitalism, must establish their own state power to enforce the transition to socialism.
It is conceived as a temporary transitional phase. The proletariat has smashed the old state, but they still need a coercive apparatus. They need a proletarian state.
The natural question is, what did this actually look like? Did Marx and Engels just leave it as an abstract philosophical placeholder, or did they have a working model of a proletarian dictatorship?
They had a very specific historical working model, and they pointed to it explicitly. 20 years after Marx coined the phrase, the workers of Paris essentially took over their city for a few months in 1871. This was the Paris Commune. And Engels later stated without hesitation, quote, "Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat.
The Paris Commune is so critical to this deep dive. We have to look at how it functioned because it completely shatters the modern assumption of what a dictatorship looks like. It sounds wildly, almost radically democratic. What actually happened in Paris in 1871?
Well, following the devastating Franco-Prussian War, the regular French army had been defeated and captured. The defense of Paris had fallen to the National Guard, which was primarily composed of working-class Parisians. When the conservative French government, led by Adolphe Thiers, tried to disarm the National Guard and take their cannons, the people of Paris revolted. The government fled to Versailles, and the workers were left in control of the capital.
And they had to figure out how to govern a major metropolis overnight. Marx extensively analyzed what they did in his work, The Civil War in France, found in Volume 22. What were the specific features of the Commune that made Marx view it as the blueprint for the proletarian state?
The first and most vital feature was how it dealt with representation. The Commune was formed by municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the city. But unlike a standard parliamentary system where you elect a representative for 4 years and they essentially do whatever they want until the next election, the delegates of the Commune were instantly revocable.
Meaning, if a delegate voted against the wishes of the people who elected them, the voters could recall them and strip them of their position that very afternoon. They were bound by formal mandates from their constituents.
Furthermore, they dismantled the privileges of the political class. The text notes that from the members of the Commune downwards, all public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The high salaries, the vested interests, the expense accounts of the state dignitaries, all of it was abolished. Politics was no longer a lucrative career path, it was a public duty.
They also fundamentally changed the structure of government. Marx praises the fact that the Commune was to be a working body, not just a parliamentary talk shop. It was executive and legislative at the same time.
This is a crucial point regarding the smashing of the old state. In a bourgeois republic, you have a parliament that makes laws, but you have a massive, unaccountable executive bureaucracy, the police, the military, the permanent civil service that actually enforces them. The Commune erased that division. The people making the laws were the ones directly responsible for executing them, removing the bureaucracy that shields the state from the people. They stripped the police of their political attributes and made them instantly revocable agents of the Commune. They abolished the standing army and replaced it with the armed people.
Okay, I have to stop and ask the obvious question. If this system is built on universal suffrage, instant recall, average wages for officials, the abolition of the standing army, and grassroots control, why on earth do they call it a dictatorship? And more fundamentally, why do they even call it a state? It just sounds like radical, localized democracy. Why does the proletariat need to maintain a state apparatus at all if their goal is freedom?
This raises an important question, and it requires us to look at the brutal historical realities they were operating within. Why does the proletariat need a state? Because the capitalist class does not simply evaporate when they lose an election.
Right. Adolphe Thiers and the French bourgeoisie didn't just sit in Versailles and say, well, the workers held an election, they've socialized the bakeries, fair play, let's pack it in.
They did the exact opposite. They reorganized their military forces, colluded with the Prussian army that had just defeated them, and marched on Paris to slaughter the communards. Volumes 45 and 47 are incredibly clear on the necessity of state power. As long as the capitalist class exists, they will fight tooth and nail to regain their property and their political dominance. The proletariat must use forcible, coercive, governmental means to hold down their ousted enemies.
I'm going to push back here, playing devil's advocate for you, the listener, because this is where the theory encounters serious friction. Doesn't this mean the proletariat is just becoming the new oppressor? If they are utilizing a coercive state apparatus to violently suppress a minority, even if that minority is the former ruling class, how is that compatible with the goal of a free society? The German Social Democrats at the time started talking about a free people's state. But isn't a free state an oxymoron if it's functioning as a dictatorship?
Your pushback is entirely justified, and it mirrors the exact debates happening in the 19th century. But Engels does not shy away from this contradiction. He leans into it with ruthless clarity. In Volume 45, in a very famous letter to August Bebel, Engels demolishes the concept of a free people's state. He writes that it is utter nonsense to talk about a free state.
He literally says the phrase is scientifically meaningless.
He says that so long as the proletariat still uses the state, it does not use it in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. The state is a weapon of class war. When you are fighting a desperate civil war to defend a revolution against domestic reactionaries and foreign empires, you are not operating in a realm of freedom. You are operating in a realm of force, coercion, and violence.
They aren't hiding the ball here. They acknowledge that the transitional period is coercive.
But the critical distinction, the entire axis upon which Marxist theory turns, is that this proletarian state is fundamentally different from every state that preceded it. Every previous state in history was a mechanism for a minority to oppress the majority. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the majority using state power to suppress a minority of former exploiters. And more importantly, its ultimate goal is not to preserve itself. Its goal is to eliminate the economic conditions that make classes, and therefore states, necessary in the first place.
Which bridges us perfectly to the economic mission of the revolution. We've established the political tool, the commune model, the armed proletariat acting as a transitional state. But what exactly do they do with that power? How do they actually dismantle the mathematical engine of capitalism we discussed in the first section?
This is where we move from political theory to economic logistics. In texts like The Principles of Communism and the Manifesto, primarily located in Volume 6, Marx and Engels lay out a practical, step-by-step roadmap for this transitional period. The proletarian state doesn't just sit there defending itself, it actively intervenes in the economy to socialize property.
Looking at the list of immediate measures they proposed, it's fascinating because some of them have actually been partially adopted by modern social democracies, while others remain incredibly radical. They advocate for a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax to immediately begin leveling wealth.
That is a mechanism to bleed the excess capital from the bourgeoisie while the transition is ongoing.
But then they go much further. The abolition of all rights of inheritance. I mean, this isn't just a tax. This is a mechanical tool to dismantle capital over time.
Let's examine the mechanics of abolishing inheritance. Capitalism relies on the accumulation of capital across generations. If a billionaire factory owner dies and the state absorbs that wealth instead of passing it to an heir, you have mathematically guaranteed that within one generation, the massive concentrations of private wealth will dissolve. It cuts the bloodline of capital accumulation.
They also call for the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. If a capitalist flees the country or takes up arms against the new state, their assets are immediately nationalized. And perhaps most importantly, they demand the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with an exclusive monopoly.
The centralization of credit is arguably the most powerful lever. Under capitalism, private banks dictate where resources flow based on what will generate the most profit. If the proletarian state controls the central bank, it controls the lifeblood of the economy. It can starve the remaining private enterprises of credit while directing massive funding towards socially owned cooperatives and public infrastructure.
All of these measures, along with centralizing communication and transport, serve a single overarching purpose: taking possession of the means of production. The state, acting as the real representative of society, steps in and turns the factories, the mines, the agricultural land, and the supply chains into public property.
And this brings us full circle to the mathematics of surplus value. By socializing the ownership of the factories, you abolish the character of capital. There is no longer a private owner purchasing labor power and extracting surplus value. The value created by the workers belongs to the society as a whole.
The battery analogy again. Society owns the battery. Society uses the electricity to power its own homes rather than selling the electricity to make a profit for a third party.
Which means production can finally be managed according to a predetermined, rational plan based on the needs of the population, rather than the chaotic, anarchic profit motive. We stop producing goods to accumulate exchange value, and we start producing them for their use value.
So we aren't producing 10,000 coats because we hope to sell them at a profit and outcompete a rival firm. We are producing 10,000 coats because the statistical data shows that 10,000 citizens need a coat for the winter. This consciously planned production is what finally breaks the vicious circle of overproduction and crashes.
But the sources introduce a deeply counterintuitive nuance here, one heavily emphasized in Volume 24. Marx and Engels make it abundantly clear that you cannot simply jump from a primitive, feudal, or undeveloped society straight into this socialist planned economy. They actually view capitalism as an absolutely necessary precondition for socialism.
This blew my mind when reading the texts. They are so ruthless in their critique of capital, yet they simultaneously praise the bourgeoisie for achieving wonders that far surpass Egyptian pyramids or Roman aqueducts. Why do they think capitalism, with all its horrors, was a necessary step?
Because the entire premise of socialism, a society where everyone's needs are met and humans are free to develop their potential, requires a massive foundation of material abundance. If you try to socialize poverty, you haven't solved anything. The struggle for basic necessities will just begin again, and the old societal hierarchies will inevitably resurface.
Who built the machinery, the global trade networks, the steamships, the railways, and the massive scale of socialized labor required to produce that abundance? The capitalists did.
Capitalism developed the productive forces to a scale previously unimaginable in human history. It socialized the labor process itself, moving production from isolated artisans in small workshops to thousands of workers cooperating in massive industrial factories. It created the very tools that make socialism technically possible.
I was thinking about how to visualize this, and an analogy came to mind. It's like capitalism is an incredibly brilliant but utterly tyrannical and brutal architect. This architect designs and builds a massive, sprawling, highly efficient, technologically advanced factory that can produce enough goods to feed and clothe the entire world. But the architect operates this factory using slave labor, working people to the bone, tossing them aside when they get injured, all to generate immense personal wealth and build bigger factories.
The structure is a marvel, but the operation is barbaric.
Exactly. When the workers rise up, the proletarian revolution doesn't bomb the factory. It doesn't smash the high-tech machinery or burn the blueprints. It simply kicks out the tyrannical architect, socializes the ownership of the building, and changes what the factory produces and who gets to benefit from it.
That analogy holds up beautifully when you consider the dialectic of Marxist theory. Capitalism essentially creates its own gravediggers. It doesn't just create the proletariat, the class that will overthrow it. It also creates the technological and economic conditions where the capitalist class itself becomes completely superfluous. Once production is fully socialized, once the factories are run by managers, technicians, and the workers themselves, the private owner who simply holds a piece of paper and pockets the dividends serves no functional purpose in the production process. They are an evolutionary dead end.
Okay, so the state has been used as a weapon to expropriate the capitalists. The factories are seized, production is planned, the economy is running on abundance. But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction in the theory. If the state is inherently a tool for class oppression, as Engels so bluntly stated, how do we ever achieve true freedom? If we have built this powerful proletarian state apparatus, complete with armed workers and centralized control, aren't we just stuck with the state forever? Do people in power ever just willingly give it up?
You have just hit upon the fault line that caused the greatest schisms in 19th century socialist thought. This exact contradiction was the battleground for the fierce debates between Marx and the anarchists, led most notably by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. These debates are heavily documented in volumes 23, 44, and 47, and they eventually tore the First International apart.
The anarchist debate is fascinating because to a casual observer, communists and anarchists seem to want the exact same endgame, a stateless, classless society of total equality. But they absolutely despised each other.
The divide was not about the destination. It was entirely about the vehicle used to get there. The anarchists demanded that the state be abolished immediately by decree on day one of the revolution. They argued that all authority is inherently corrupting.
Bakunin essentially said, burn the state to the ground immediately. No provisional governments, no dictatorships of the proletariat. You cannot create freedom by using a tool of enslavement. He accused Marx of being an authoritarian who would just replace the capitalist ruling class with a new, privileged class of state bureaucrats and intellectuals. Given the trajectory of the Soviet Union decades later, Bakunin's critique sounds almost prophetic to modern ears.
What's fascinating here is how Marx and Engels responded. It is a powerful critique, so we have to look closely at why they thought the anarchists were fundamentally wrong. Why insist on keeping the state around, even temporarily, if it's such a dangerous tool?
Engels' response is razor-sharp. He points out the logistical absurdity of abolishing all authority overnight. He asks the anarchists, how do you propose to run a massive cotton-spinning factory, or coordinate a national railway network, or steer a ship across the ocean without some form of unified direction and authority? A modern industrial economy requires coordination, and coordination implies administration. You can't just have everyone voting on every single turn of a ship's wheel.
But the logistics are secondary to the political reality. Engels points out that you cannot abolish the state by decree, while the economic conditions that necessitated the state, namely class divisions, still exist. The state is a symptom of a disease. You can't cure the disease by just outlawing the symptom.
You can't just stand in the town square on day one and declare classes are hereby abolished. You actually have to do the generational economic work of socializing property, reorganizing production, and changing how humanity interacts with resources. And while you are doing that work, the former ruling class is actively trying to kill you.
That is the crux of it.
Yeah.
If you abolish the state immediately, the workers have no centralized organization, no arms force, no coordinated mechanism to defend the revolution. Engels brutally reminds the anarchists that if the Paris Commune had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie, it wouldn't have lasted a single day. To destroy the state while the capitalists are still armed and fighting to get their property back is to invite a massacre. It is intellectual purity at the cost of practical suicide.
Okay, I understand the necessity of the transitional state for survival, but the question remains, how does it ever go away? We know that institutions tend to perpetuate themselves. How do we get from the dictatorship of the proletariat to stateless communism?
This is the culmination of their entire theory, and it relies on a specific chain of causality. The state, in the Marxist framework, is not abolished by the proletariat, it dies out. Or in a more famous translation from Engels' Anti-Düring, it withers away.
The withering away of the state. How exactly does a massive administrative and coercive apparatus just wither away?
Let's trace the logic step by step. What is the fundamental definition of the state in this theory? It is a special repressive force designed to keep one class subjugated by another. That is its only true political function.
Right.
So the proletarian state takes control of the means of production. It begins converting private property into social property. As this economic transition progresses, the differences between the capitalist and the worker vanish. Everyone becomes a producer. The economic basis for class division is slowly eradicated.
If the private ownership of capital is gone, the capitalist class ceases to exist as a distinct class.
Exactly. And if there are no more classes, there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection. There is no one left to oppress. And if there is nothing to repress, a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary.
It's like an immune system. When the body is fighting a massive infection, the immune system ramps up, generates white blood cells, triggers a fever. It's violent, it's coercive, it takes over the whole system. But once the infection is completely destroyed, you don't have to pass a law telling the immune system to stand down. It just naturally recedes. It ramps down because the pathogen is gone.
That analogy perfectly illustrates Engels' point. As the economic transformation takes root, state interference in social relations becomes superfluous in one domain after another and then dies out of itself. The political, coercive functions of the state gradually lose their character. The need for police to protect private property vanishes when property is communal. The need for an army vanishes when the global class struggle concludes.
But society doesn't just revert to hunter-gatherers. We still have that massive high-tech factory. We still need to run the trains, manage the power grid, and coordinate global supply chains. What replaces the state in managing all of this?
The text gives us a beautiful connotating phrase for this endpoint. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production.
The administration of things, that is a profound shift in perspective.
It is the ultimate goal of the entire Marxist project. You still have administrators, you still have statisticians, logistics coordinators, and managers to ensure enough wheat is grown and enough coats are manufactured. But it is no longer a political power. It is no longer an apparatus of humans using violence to coerce other humans. It is purely logistical management. It becomes a free association of producers.
As Marx writes in Volume 6, it becomes an association where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. The proletariat, having eliminated all other classes, ultimately abolishes itself as a class. Because if everyone is a worker, no one is a worker in the class sense, just humans.
And at that moment, as Engels writes, humanity finally leaps from the kingdom of necessity into the kingdom of freedom. The struggle for mere survival ends, and the true history of human potential begins. That is the complete theoretical arc, from the microscopic extraction of unpaid labor hours on a 19th century factory floor, all the way to the reorganization of human civilization into a stateless, classless society.
So what does this all mean? Let's trace the thread of this deep dive for you, our listener, one last time. We began with the mathematical certainty of surplus value, the diagnosis that profit is inherently generated by unpaid labor, meaning that capitalism is structurally built on exploitation that cannot be reformed away.
We saw how that structural flaw inevitably generates inescapable crises of overproduction. making the capitalist system an obstacle to further human progress, starving people in the midst of abundance.
We explored why the working class cannot just vote their way out of this trap using the bourgeois state, because that state, the boa constrictor, is a weapon designed specifically to protect capital and suppress labor.
Therefore, the old state machinery must be smashed entirely. In its place, the workers establish a temporary transitional state power, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Modeled on the radical, recallable democracy of the Paris Commune, its sole purpose is to use political power to socialize the means of production and forcefully suppress the inevitable violent resistance of the old ruling class.
And finally, as the economy is successfully socialized, as inheritance is abolished and credit is centralized, class distinctions melt away. Without classes to oppress, the state itself loses its reason to exist. It doesn't need to be abolished by an anarchist decree. It simply withers away like an immune response, leaving behind a purely administrative, stateless society capable of planning production for human need.
It's a theoretical framework of immense scale, attempting to map the entire past, present, and future of human economic development.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you to mull over. While digging through these sources, I found a specific, fascinating quote from Engels in Volume 3. He was looking toward the future, and he wrote that if producers simply knew how much consumers required, and if they could consciously organize production to share it amongst themselves, the brutal fluctuations of competition and economic crises would be impossible.
A vision of a perfectly mapped, perfectly communicative economy where supply exactly meets demand without the chaos of the market.
Right. And reading that in the mid-19th century, it sounds like utopian science fiction. How could anyone possibly know what everyone across a nation needs at any given moment? But look at our modern world today. Look at the vast networks of big data, global supply chains, predictive algorithms, AI, and supercomputing.
The logistical capacity to administer things on a global scale is no longer science fiction.
Think about companies like Amazon or Walmart. Internally, they operate as massive, centrally planned economies. They use predictive algorithms to know exactly how many rolls of paper towels a specific zip code will need next Tuesday, and they pre-position that inventory in a warehouse before you even click order. The internal logistics are perfectly consciously planned.
They have built the exact logistical apparatus required to administer things globally.
So here's the question for you to explore on your own. Do we now, today, possess the exact technological capability to consciously plan production that Marx and Engels dreamed of? Are the tools to end the kingdom of necessity currently sitting right in our server farms waiting to be socialized? Or, because we still live under the structural rules of capital, does the mathematical reality of surplus value mean these incredible tools will only ever be used to extract more profit, monitor workers more closely, and sell us more things we don't actually need? Can technology transcend the economic system it was built within, or is it destined to just amplify it?
That is a question that proves these 19th century texts, despite their age, are still actively diagnosing the contradictions of our 21st century world.
Thank you, our listener, for bringing this incredible, challenging stack of sources to the table for this deep dive. Remind yourself to keep exploring and questioning the structures around you, because at the end of the day, the economic machine we all live inside wasn't built by nature. It was built by history, and history is always still being written.